Hi, my name is Dr. John Lipczynski. I'm the module leader for the Business Environment and Strategic Management. What I'll be doing in these sets of slides is to go through the material I covered the weekend of the end of June, beginning of July. This is not supposed to be a complete copy of what I presented. It's simply a resume. And Nashuba and Roman will undoubtedly be doing their own presentations. Okay, well, let's begin with what we mean by strategic management. Strategic management is defined in the following way. It gives direction to corporate values, corporate culture, corporate goals, and corporate missions. When we say it gives direction, it means it determines, it gives sort of a leadership to corporate values. Corporate values could be things like how the firm will treat its workforce, how the firm will treat its investors, and so on. Strategic management will also determine corporate culture. So will the structure be democratic, or will it be autocratic, or something in between? Corporate goals are very specific goals, more short-run goals, and the corporate mission is more vague, a little bit more general, and it is something that firms will consider for the long run. Okay, this is slide 3. If you look at strategic management and how best to analyse it, of course it can be tackled from many angles, from many different ways. First of all, most common, I suppose, is to look at management studies. And management studies essentially help with managers' decision making. Things like Porter's 5 forces, or the model, the SWOT model. SWOT being strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the model suggests that groups of managers ought to work out these factors and then determine policy on the basis of these factors. Another approach is a sociological approach. Firms, organizations are made up of people. People group themselves. People work in teams. People then bargain for to determine various goals and so on. Thirdly, we have a legal approach to the study of strategic management. The law does define the structure of companies. The law can be a way of constraining the behaviour of managers. For example, the way managers treat their workforce, or how they treat their shareholders. And law can also be used in the context of contracts, and there are people who suggest that the firm is really a nexus of contracts, sort of a central control over all the contracts a particular organisation has. Let's now move on to slide number 4. So the firm can also be looked at, examined in the cultural context. So you have a corporate ethos, you look at the way the Japanese will look at the firm, and you compare that with, say, the German way of determining how a company should be run, and so on. A focus on competencies is the focus on doing what you're good at. You could look at the firm, or examine the firm from an economic point of view, a strictly sort of economic theory point of view, where here the problem is one of scarcity. So the firm is seen as a way of managing your scarce resources, and what the firm does is to extract the surplus value. Commonly the surplus value would be corporate profits, although there could be many other forms of rents, other extractions of surplus value. Finally, we have the industrial organisation approach, which is the one that I am skilled in, one I have specialised in. Okay, here we are, slide 5, and we're examining corporate management, how it can be broken down into various strategies. To begin with, you have corporate strategy, which is the direction a corporation must take to exploit its opportunities. There's a business strategy, which means creating and maintaining some competitive advantage in the market. We also have a functional strategy. This is how the corporation will deal with its various functional areas, such as marketing, finance, human resource management, research and development, and so on. And finally, we get the operational strategy, is how resources are employed in the firm, the building block of corporation. Moving on to slide 6. The approaches you can take to study corporate management are various, and some of the approaches are summarised on this slide. So, as I've mentioned earlier, SWOT analysis. SWOT is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. So what people do in the firm is to examine those topics and see if they can cope with the topics, what the answers are to the topics. Secondly, we have the experience curve, which is a function of time. So the more times you repeat the job, the more times you create a service or a product, the lower the average cost will be, the more efficient you become. You also have core competencies, which is an identification of the firm of what they are really good at over time. You have honed some sort of competitive advantage through your competencies. Fourth bullet point is the value chain, and this is putting a value on all the various stages of production and distribution. Finally, we have industry structure and performance, which I'll be looking at very soon. So moving on to slide 7. Okay, here we are, slide number 7, and this is where I begin my contributions to this module, my inputs to this module. And fundamentally what my input is to identify the economic environment that has affected business decision making, and we do this through an analysis of the area that I specialise in, plus also microeconomic theory and macroeconomic theory. So let's move on to slide 8. What is it that you'll be able to achieve once I've finished my inputs, when I finish my teaching? Well, you'll know about the structure, conduct, performance paradigm model approach. You'll know something about the key microeconomic issues that will influence firms, and you'll identify and analyse macroeconomic factors, also very, very important in making decisions within the corporation. So slide 9, structure, conduct, performance paradigm. Remember, paradigm means simply a model or an approach. It's the paradigm word is used because it's just historical and it's traditional. It's a bit unfortunate because students are a bit worried about what the meaning of the word is, but structure, conduct, performance model is enough. So what does it actually mean, this paradigm? Well, basically we wish to study industries and firms, and the way in which we study industries and firms in my branch of economics, industrial organisation, is to take structure, which then leads to conduct, which is strategy, and then that leads to some outcome, which is performance. Structure, conduct and performance. Before I go into the variables that affect structure and so on, slide 11 identifies the usefulness of this paradigm. Well, firstly, there is a huge amount of data swimming around in the corporate world, and it's important that we can classify this data into various categories, bring some order to the mess, to the huge amounts of data floating around. Secondly, the model, the paradigm, is consistent with the economic theory of the firm. The economic theory of the firm makes specific predictions, and the model that we will develop is in line with what you would expect. It also provides an analysis of corporate performance, so it's clearly a sort of a blueprint to look at the performance, and consequently, the fourth bullet point, consequently, governments use this to determine their performance vis-a-vis industry. So, for example, they might be looking at research and development policies or competition policies, and their reports will tend to follow the structure, conduct and performance paradigms. And finally, of course, it also provides important information for investors. Okay, let's move on to slide 12. Slide 12. Here we have a classical view of the market structure. And remember, market structures can be looked at locally, internationally, as well as nationally. So let's begin. Here we have a spectrum of structure. And at one end of the spectrum, we have perfect competition, an ideal form of perfect competition. And this is characterized by an infinite number of firms. At the other extreme, we have monopoly, and monopoly is characterized by just one firm. Perfect competition is made up of a number of assumptions, so there will be many producers, theoretically an infinite number of producers. There'll be many buyers, they will be producing a very similar product. There will be no barriers to entry or very low barriers to entry. And finally, there is perfect knowledge. In other words, no actor, no player in the market is ignorant of what is going on. There are no trade secrets, for example. Well, this is a spectrum, and into this spectrum we can place a number of recognized structures, economic structures of the firm, of industry. So initially we have an area here in red, which we will call near perfect competition, and the sort of industry which will be classified as near perfect would be agriculture and the stock market. So if you think of agriculture, okay, there are many farmers, there certainly are many buyers in theory. They all produce a fairly similar product. So if you're a wheat farmer, whether you farm in Scotland or whether you farm in Cornwall, you are producing exactly the same product. No entry barriers. It's relatively easy to buy a farm. The entry barrier might well be the capital requirements, but they're quite low. And finally, there is perfect knowledge. In other words, agricultural techniques are open to everyone. Knowledge is freely available. We now move on to the next part of the spectrum, which is occupied by monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition identifies those small firms, of which there are thousands, who have some degree of power in the market. And the power in the market they have is determined by their differentiation. So restaurants may all look alike. Italian restaurants may certainly look alike, but of course each restaurant does try and differentiate its service, the size, the number of tables, the size of the menu, the furnishings, the how well waiters look after you, and so on. And same goes for universities as well. They all offer the same degree. The degree has been, in the UK, degrees have been validated by the QAA, the Quality Assurance Agency. So the degrees are the same, but of course you all know that a university like Oxford will be seen as being totally different to, say, the University of West of England. We move on now to a purple segment there, which is oligopoly. And oligopoly, which means a few firms, from the Greek oligoi and paleo. Oligopolies really occupy a pretty big chunk of the spectrum. The spectrum, by the way, is not drawn to scale. And in an oligopoly, what happens is that firms are few, they recognize rivalry. You can readily identify who your rivals are. It therefore means you are interdependent. What your rival does will affect you, and what you do will affect your rivals. So there is this interdependency, and as soon as you have rivalry, you have uncertainty. So the goal of oligopolies, the very general goal of oligopolies, is how to deal with rivalry. Examples of that would be airlines, the cement industry, and the vast amount of work done in industrial organisation is to do with oligopolistic behaviour. Finally, we have monopoly, and of course rarely do we have one firm unless it's government sponsored. The sort of industries would be sort of what we call near monopolies, would be TV broadcasting, ethical drugs, where pharmaceutical companies have licenses or patents. This would be regarded as pretty powerful firms. Moving on to slide number 13. Okay, slide 13. Let's examine a number of structural variables. Well, the most important, of course, is the number of sellers and buyers in an industry, but also what's important is the size distribution. So if you have 10 firms, it matters whether the top firm accounts for 90% of the market and the rest share just 10% share of the market, or an industry where the size distribution is such where the firms are of equal size, near equal size. Total different behaviour in those two instances. So size distribution is important. Structural variables also include entry and exit conditions. How high are the barriers? How low are they? Vertical integration, in other words, how far firms integrate with the supply side of the business. How far do they integrate downwards into distribution? Diversification is also a structural variable. How are firms diversified? What sort of advantages could be drawn from that diversification? And finally, we have, by the way, not finally, because there are a huge number of other structural variables. These are just some of the main ones. Economies of scale is the efficiency of a firm. And the big question is, have you worked out, have you exploited all your economies? Can you not be more and more efficient? So that's an important issue. Moving on to slide 14 is what I had intended to be discussed in class. And I suppose you could just consider this as regards your own organisation. It will figure in your coursework. So look at the structural characteristics. How many rivals does your organisation have? In fact, does it have rivals? What about the entry barriers? Is it easy to move into your industry, or is it relatively high? What role does the government play, for example? What about the buyers? Are there many buyers, or is there just one or two buyers and they can exert a lot of power? What about efficiency of the firm? How far down the long run average cost curve have you come? How efficient are you? Try to be neutral about this. In other words, try not to be swayed by your organisation. Don't try to be a loyalist. Try to see the organisation from a neutral point of view, from an objective point of view. Okay, let's move on to slide number 15. Slide number 15, we are now moving into conduct and strategy. So from structure structure will determine behaviour, conduct and so on, strategy. So what sort of conduct variables have we identified and discussed? Well, first of all, business objectives. The main business objective will clearly be to allot people profits. But of course, in reality, there are many, many other objectives. For example, increasing the market value of the company, growth in total revenue, and possibly even just survival or satisfactory profits is the dominant objective. What about pricing policies? Well, again, structure will determine your pricing policy. So if the barriers are low, you may decide that you wish to fix entry deterring pricing. If you are a monopoly, you may fix a monopoly price. As a monopoly, you can also fix price discrimination. Possibly in an oligopoly, you might have something called price leadership, and so on. Endless number of pricing. An important oligopoly pricing policy would be collusive pricing. Firms get together and operate as one, and they fix prices. They have a price list. Thirdly, product design, research and development and branding. Here we have a possibility that some structures are more conducive to research and development, others less so. Advertising and marketing, again, what role does it play? Again, depends very much on the structure. Is it a tight oligopoly? Is it a loose oligopoly? How strong is the rivalry, and so on. The next bullet point will be collusion. If there are a few firms that are doing badly, profits are low, they may well decide that the best strategy is to collude, work together, form a cartel. Failing that, if the law is pretty strict, firms may move into mergers or acquisitions. Instead of cooperating together, firms decide to take over other firms and achieve some degree of peace and quiet in that way. Conduct and strategy could also be corporate social responsibility. Again, depending on the structure, corporate social responsibility will be either a major factor or could be a small factor. So if you are say a very small firm operating in a monopolistic competition or in perfect competition, then corporate social responsibility isn't that high on your list. However, if you are in a very tight oligopoly, corporate social responsibility does, apart from the ethical side, of course, corporate social responsibility does confer various economic market benefits. Moving on to slide 16, which is what I've already discussed. So this slide is redundant. Okay, here we are, slide 17. So we've examined structure, we've looked at conduct, and now let's move on to the final stage, which is performance variables. So what is the main performance variable? What are the main performance variables? Well, firstly, profitability. I suppose we would all agree that if firms are making profits, then they are carrying out a reasonably successful strategy. Growth, it might well be possible that some firms will wish to grow at the expense of profits, and growth will confer certain benefits in the future. Performance could also be judged by the quality of product or service. So if firms are in competition, if there are tight oligopolies, then they will focus on quality as one way of differentiating their goods, their services. Similarly, if you're in an oligopoly, one way to get some sort of competitive advantage is to ensure that your economies have all been exploited, fully exploited. So if there are any inefficiencies left in the firm, or if there are inefficiencies in the firm, you must try and reduce those inefficiencies. Next is technological progress. Technological progress is seen as one of the great contributors to oligopolistic strategy. It gets rid of rivalry. You have a degree of monopoly power in the market if you come up with a very successful product. And this is a very important performance variable. Governments, in fact, do favour firms that have a positive track record in technology. And finally, we have responsible capitalism. This is, sort of from an ethical point of view, from a justice point of view, is what one would expect. And certainly the law does have a say in what responsibility means. But here we're looking at structure, and to what extent does structure determine responsible capitalism? Well, if the industry is competitive, very competitive, there's less emphasis on the responsible capitalism. If, however, the firm finds itself in an oligopoly with just a few firms, then responsible capitalism could be one way of achieving some degree of power in the market. We can all recognise firms that have a good track record, look after their labour force well, treat governments, local governments with respect, and so on. And so they certainly is a return, an economic return to the strategy of corporate social responsibility. Let's move on to slide. This is slide 18. Well, let's look at the model. So far we've looked at structure, and structure leads to conduct, which leads to performance. But of course, the direction of causation can equally be the other way around, such that performance may change conduct, which may then change the structure of the industry. So, for example, if a firm is doing badly in an oligopoly, it may decide to change its conduct. In other words, it would collude. Not in other words, but collusion might well be the one of the solutions. And collusion, what is collusion? What is a cartel? It's essentially a monopoly. The group of firms control the whole market. We also have the microeconomy. The structure itself doesn't just sort of exist in any vacuum. It is determined by the microeconomy, essentially by demand and supply, demand from consumers and the supply of products, the producers, the actions of producers, and both these lead to determining the structure. Likewise, we have the macroeconomy and government policies, and these policies will affect structure, it will affect conduct or behaviour of firms, and it will affect performance. So, for example, if the government feels that the structure is too powerful, if an industry is too powerful, it will then try to regulate that industry. Conduct could be regulation of pricing, for example, and performance could be giving tax breaks to firms that are doing well in exports. So that's the extension of the model. What about the criticisms? This is, by the way, slide 90. What are the criticisms of the structure, conduct, performance paradigm? Well, firstly, it's a static approach. It tells you the state of the industry now. It doesn't try to explain how the industry got to where it is, and it certainly wouldn't make any, doesn't sort of make predictions about the future, the future directions of where it should go. So it's this sort of very static, very dry approach. Secondly, there is a critique that there might be an overemphasis on classical microeconomic theory. So people who have developed the model haven't strayed too far from their traditional backgrounds of microeconomics. And of course that hole has been filled by management science. Thirdly, it's very difficult to know where some variables belong. Are the variables structural? Are they behavioural? Are they performance variables? So, for example, you might have diversification. Diversification could be a way of defining the structure of firms in an industry, but it could also be a conduct variable. So firms in some sort of oligopoly might decide the only way of freeing themselves from that tyranny of oligopoly might be to diversify into different areas and then enjoy profits from different sources, achieve power that way. What about performance? The criticisms of performance is that a lot of research has focused on a very narrow metric of performance, typically profits, the return on capital. But of course that implies that all the firms in an industry are united in trying to maximize their profits. And of course firms may well have very different goals. For example, a firm may wish to spend money on growth, put money into vertical integration. So they may well feel that they've been very successful, but the profits have been lowered, and therefore an investigator or researcher into the industry will see that profits are low for a firm and then deem that firm to be relatively unsuccessful. Finally, we have a very brief question. So is there an objective measure of corporate performance? How does your organization measure performance? It probably has very many different measures. Okay, well, that's something to mull over. And here we have the reading. The reading is actually my book, Lipczynski, and the other two authors are Wilson and Goddard. And the book is Industrial Organisation. In fact, what I'll do is I'll get the book from my shelf, just a minute. Okay, this is the book, Industrial Organisation, and a lot of what I've discussed can be found in this book. Right, that is the end of the first part. Okay, slide 22, the microeconomy. The word microeconomy refers to the study of individual units. So the study of consumer behaviour, the study of firms, the study of industries, the study of how individual factors of production behave. This is different to the macroeconomy, which is a study of economic aggregates, such as the price level, trade, unemployment, growth. The traditional analysis of the microeconomy starts with looking at consumer demand. Slide 23. For an organisation to determine its objectives, its goals, it must be aware of the market it finds itself in. So it must have a reasonable knowledge about the demand it faces from its clients, its customers, what economists will call consumer demand. It must be aware of all the factors that influence supply, and consequently it must know something about the market equilibrium, the bringing together of demand and supply to determine an equilibrium output, and importantly an equilibrium price. What is the price in the market? Slide 24. So let's examine the consumer demand. Of course, demand can also be examined for firms. It could be discussed, analysed for individual industries, government, and so on. There are differences, but fundamentally they would go through the same sort of factors, the same sort of issues. So anyway, let's focus on consumer demand. And we list a number of factors which might influence the demand for some good X. So we'll be looking at all these in turn: price of X, price of other goods, the income of the consumer, consumers' tastes, expectations, rates of interests, how other consumers may influence the choice a consumer may make, and all other unknown influences. Slide 25. The first one is demand as a function of price, which is probably the most important. And there is in economics something called the law of demand, and it's quite simple. It's the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, which means the inverse relationship means as prices fall, quantity demanded rises. You see the arrows, price falls and quantity demanded rises. Or as price rises, quantity demanded falls. And this is the inverse relationship, and I'm sure all of you would agree that that is realistic. It's something you have experienced. Inverse relationships are shown by negative functions. So we can plot a negatively sloped demand curve, and a demand curve is a relationship, a function of comparing price to quantity demanded. And here on the graph we have the two axes, price and quantity demanded, and we have a demand curve. The demand curve is negatively sloped, which represents the law of demand. Question: can you think of cases where the demand curve may exhibit a positive slope? In other words, could there be cases where a higher price may generate a higher demand? And I suppose the answer is there are three possible cases. The first one is when you look at speculative demand. If consumers believe that prices will rise in the future, they will buy more now. Think of the stock market. If you believe share prices will rise, you will buy more now. So higher prices will generate a greater demand. Another explanation for a positively sloped demand curve might well be demand intended to impress other people. Intended to impress other people by its high price. This of course affects a small group of people in the economy, but rich people do like to show off their wealth, and the more expensive the item, the greater the demand. This is, however, for a very small segment of the market. If a firm finds itself producing Porsche cars or selling Porsche cars, then a firm certainly knows that an increase in price may increase the demand for the product. The third possibility is where a higher price signals a better quality of good. So there are consumers who are ignorant of the characteristics, the qualities of a particular good, and they will look to price to determine the quality. For example, a bottle of wine, you may know very little about wine, you are guided by the price. So if you look at a bottle of Bulgarian claret at £5 a bottle and compare that with a French claret at £50 a bottle, you assume that the French claret is superior to the Bulgarian claret. Consequently, demand will rise or may rise if the price is increased in a small segment of the market, of course. The next question on slide 26 is why are the slopes of some demand curves steep and others are relatively shallow? Of course, this does depend on the way in which you draw the axes, but keep that stable, keep that consistent. There will be functions that will determine a higher slope and other functions which are of a lower slope. What are the implications for pricing decisions to a firm? This is very important. If a firm faces a steep demand curve, then by increasing price, demand will not fall by very much. So a 10% increase in price may result in just a 1% fall in demand. That would be represented by a steep demand curve. If a firm knows that it's facing a shallow demand curve, in other words, if it were to increase price by 1% and the demand will fall by 20%, the firm knows that it is facing a shallow demand curve. This is all to do with what we call in economics price elasticity of demand. It's the responsiveness of the market to a price change. And again, this is crucial for firms to understand. What will happen if I increase price or if I decrease price? Let's look at the second factor that influences consumer demand, and this is the price of other goods that affect the demand for our particular good. So let's look at the price of good Y and the demand for our good X. So we have two potential relationships. We have a positive relationship and then we have a negative relationship. So the positive relationship is that if the price of Y rises, and that leads to the quantity of X rising, the two arrows are going in the upward direction. Or if the price of Y falls and the quantity of X falls, we have a positive relationship. In that case, X and Y are substitutes. And examples of substitutes would be beef and lamb, Coke and Pepsi, and so on. Thousands of examples of substitutes. Let's take beef and lamb as an example, and let's look at the first line. If the price of beef were to rise, that would lead to an increase in the quantity demanded of lamb. Beef becomes more expensive, people switch to the substitute, which is lamb, so demand will rise. Let's look at the next relationship. If the price of Y falls, so if the price of beef falls, more people will buy beef, and then the demand for lamb will fall. So these are known as substitutes. Looking at the next line, you have a negative relationship where the price of Y, the increase in the price of Y leads to a fall in the quantity demanded of X, or if the price of Y falls, that leads to an increase in the demand for X, a negative relationship. In this case, X and Y are called complements. So for example, cars and petrol, razor and blades, and once again, thousands of other examples. Let's take cars and petrol, and let's look at that first line again, the top line. If the price of cars were to rise, then that would be a decrease in the demand for cars and consequently a decrease in the quantity demanded of petrol. So your demand for petrol is very much influenced by the price of cars. Taking the next relationship, if there is a fall in the price of cars, then people will buy more cars, and that will mean people demand more petrol, a negative relationship. For any two goods drawn at random, remember there will be a zero relationship. I'm saying remember, there will be a zero relationship. So take an example of ice cream and demand for hospital beds. So here we have a very easy way in which firms can determine whether they are determine their substitutes and determine complements. This is important for pricing decisions. Slide 28, the demand as a function of consumers' income. First of all, we have a positive relationship, which are referred to as normal goods. This means as income rises, this leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of X. Y, the letter Y, represents income in economics. So an increase in income leads to an increase in quantity demanded of X. Or if there's a fall in income, there will be a fall in the quantity demanded of X. These are known as normal goods, and I'm sure you can think of many, many examples where your demand will increase because you are well off. So the demand for holidays, the demand for better restaurants, these will all be normal goods. Again, it's important that firms should know whether they are producing, whether they are offering the market a normal good. What will be the effect of increasing incomes on their sales? The opposite of normal goods are inferior goods, and this is a negative relationship. So as your income rises, the quantity demanded of X falls, or if income falls, your demand for X rises. These are inferior goods. It doesn't mean the quality is inferior, it simply means that you are switching to the other more expensive good. An example of that would be if you take skiing holidays. If your income rises, you no longer ski in Bulgaria, I'm assuming. I hope there are no Bulgarian students. So you reduce your demand for your Bulgarian holiday and you will switch to, say, Switzerland. Equally, if your income falls, then let's take shopping. So you may shop at Waitrose, which is an upmarket supermarket. So if your income falls, this means you may well increase your shopping in somewhere like Asda. Asda being perceived by consumers as being of a lower standard than Waitrose. A zero relationship it simply means quantity demanded is unaffected by changes in income. So as your income rises, your demand for toilet paper remains constant. Your demand for newspapers remains constant. Again, here we have a neat way of looking at the relationship between income and demand for goods, and it's a mathematical relationship. Positive, negative, and zero relationships. Once again, it's I've reiterated that it's important that organisations should know what changes in national income will have on their market, on their consumers' demand. Slide 29. Let's consider some of the other variables that affect consumer demand. Firstly, we have consumer tastes. Different consumers have different tastes. Think of buying a car and deciding which colour of car you should buy. This will be determined by your taste, which is determined by various sociological factors and various psychological inputs. Secondly, you have consumers' expectations. A consumer may well expect prices to rise, and that will affect his demand now. Or consumers may expect to be sacked, to lose their jobs, their income will go down, so they may well change their pattern of spending now. Rates of interest will affect demand. So if you're looking to buy a house and the rates of interest fall, you will certainly demand a better house. You will find that your real income has moved up, has increased, and you can afford to buy more expensive houses. Demand from other consumers, demands of other consumers. Well, this occurs where a consumer is a little uncertain, is a little bit ignorant of the market it finds itself in, and the consumer will look to the lead from other consumers. Trends, fashions, this is the sort of thing that will affect a particular consumer. And of course, firms must know whether the their consumers will be affected by other consumers, and this is referred to in economics and indeed in marketing as the bandwagon effect. Children are subject to the bandwagon effect. If children see other children enjoying a particular toy, they will want that toy as well. And finally, we have to include, for the sake of completeness, that there are many, many other known influences or unknown influences, sometimes a bit too small to measure. For example, weather might have an effect on consumer demand. Okay, sorry for that hitch. Slide 30. Here we discuss shifts versus movements along the demand curve. Important to note that if there's a change in price, all that happens is that we have a new set of coordinates. So there is movement along the demand curve. Price is at P1, quantity demanded is at Q1. If price falls to P2, then you read off the new quantity demanded, which will be Q2. So you move from A, point A on the demand curve, to point B. So there will be a movement along the demand curve. So remember, change in price will simply cause a movement along the demand curve. You move from A to B. Nothing else happens. Slide 31. Let's look at changes other than price. What will happen here is that there will be a shift in the function. So let's look at the first diagram on the left. And let's assume there's an increase in income. Price is P1, quantity demanded is Q1. That's reading off the demand curve at point A. If there's an increase in income, this will cause a rightward shift. There will be a new function, dy2, a rightward shift. Consequently, at price P1, you reach point B on the new demand function, and quantity demanded is Q2, OQ2. Price has not changed. All that's happened is that there's been an increase in income, and an increase in income means a rightward shift. Let's look at another example, this time increase in interest rates. That's the second diagram. So here you have a demand curve, dr1, and price P1 and quantity demanded at Q1. An increase in interest rates will mean that there will be a leftward shift in the demand curve. You move from dr1 to dr2. As interest rates rise, then consumers will wish to buy less. So there's a leftward shift in the demand curve. We have a new equilibrium point, a new point, which is at point B. So reading from this new demand curve, at price P1, quantity demanded will be at Q2. So there's a fall in the quantity demanded. Generally speaking, we would conclude a rightward shift is or signals an increase in demand, and a leftward shift for a decrease in demand. It's up to you to try and work out what the effect will be from any change in the variables and decide which way the demand curve will move. Right for an increase in demand, left for a decrease in demand. Price remaining the same. Price remaining the same. Okay, once again, apologies for the break. Slide number 33, and here we look now at the supply function. We've covered demand, and this is supply as seen from the point of view of the firm. So how does the firm react? Well, what are the influences, the variables that firms react to when considering the level of supply? There is, if you observe the real world, a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied, all other things being equal. In other words, as price falls, quantity produced will also fall. As price rises, quantity produced rises as well. It's to do with profits. As prices fall, profits will be lower, and then firms will reduce their quantity supplied or move out of the market. If prices were to rise, there is a promise of higher profits, and firms will react with increased supply. So this positive relationship, this direct relationship, is shown by a supply curve, and you'll see the same sort of axes for the demand curve. We draw a supply curve. Slide 34. Just like a demand curve, changes in the price of a good will simply result in a movement along the supply curve, whereas changes in variables other than price, for example, cost of factors, technology, price of other goods, these will result in a shift in the supply curve. An increase in supply is shown by a rightward shift, and a decrease in supply by a leftward shift. So very, very similar to the methodology used to analyze a consumer demand. Slide number 35, quantity supplied as a function of other variables. So for example, a factor that might decide firms' production of goods or services could be the price of other goods and services that can also be produced by the firm. So you might be producing some agricultural good, so you use your land to produce strawberries, and then you find that the price of raspberries has risen. The potential profits from supplying raspberries are much greater, so you switch from strawberries into the production of raspberries. So price of other goods or services is important, and successful firms are always aware of how best to use their resources. Switch to those activities where the price is higher. Move away from activities where the price is falling. Other factors that would influence supply would be the price of factors of production. So if the wage costs go up in a particular activity, then you will obviously be influencing your supply decisions. Technology, if there's an increase in technology, it reduces costs of production. That will influence the supply. Producers' tastes. Many decisions are taken in the firm simply on the basis of producers' desires based on sociological, psychological functions. One can't discount that individuals do play a part in determining whether to supply more or less of a particular good. And finally, producers' expectations are very important. All producers, all strategic decision makers have to have a view about the future and act accordingly. And finally, for the sake of completeness, there will be many other known or unknown influences that would typically, however, not be considered in the estimation of these supply functions. Having identified demand and supply, we can bring the two together on slide 36. So bringing the two together, you will see there is a unique point. There is an equilibrium price denoted by PE in brackets PM, which is a market price. And the market price determines where quantity is at an equilibrium, and equilibrium quantity simply means quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So here you have market equilibrium. Important for firms to know what the equilibrium price will be. If for some reason price were not at the equilibrium, so price is at P1, what happens is that demand now will fall. Higher prices mean consumers abandon this market, abandon the demand for this product. However, from the firm's point of view, the higher price will mean more will be supplied. Higher price in the minds of the supplier simply mean greater profits, and they will supply more. So you have the distance between QD1 and QS1. That distance, denoted by the red arrows, is a surplus. Quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. You have a surplus, you have a glut in the market. What happens next? If you have a surplus, you will try to reduce the surplus, reduce the extra supply by reducing price. So prices will fall until the equilibrium price is re-established. Discounts will be offered by firms to just sell off all the extra stock that hasn't been bought by the consumer. So if there is a surplus, prices will fall. All other things being equal, of course, and this is just a free market. This analysis can also be applied to if there's a price fall from the equilibrium price, and I'm not going to draw this on the diagram, it'll become all a bit messy, but if there's a fall in price from PE, if the price is below PE, this will result in a shortage. The quantity demanded will be greater than the quantity supplied. Once again, if there is a shortage, then the price of the available goods will be bid up. Firms will deal with the shortage by increasing their price. So prices rise. Two things to conclude. Firstly, the market equilibrium is stable. In other words, if there is any disturbance away from the price equilibrium, like P1 or price below PE, then there will be movements in price to re-establish that equilibrium. It's stable. It always tends to that equilibrium. The second point to note is that the market price, or the equilibrium price, is a market clearing price. Market clearing price, it means everything that's produced for the market is bought. No surpluses, no shortages. The market is cleared. Slide 37. Let's look at changes in market variables other than price, and what happens if there are changes in these variables. Then there will be a shift in the demand or the supply curve, and you will have new equilibria. So for example, if you have a shortage of raw materials, this affects the supply function. If there's a shortage of raw materials, less will be supplied. There will be a leftward shift in the supply curve. So you have a new supply curve, S1, and you will have a new equilibrium point. And the price will be P1, it will rise to P1, and the quantity demanded will be Q1. So you have a new set of circumstances, a new equilibrium. Again, it will be a stable equilibrium, but it will be a new equilibrium. Let's just get rid of that example and get rid of S1 at the top. Let's look at an increase in incomes. If there's an increase in incomes, and if the good in question is a normal good, so if there's an increase in incomes, there will be an increase in the demand for these goods, for the good, and the demand curve will shift to D2. A rightward shift in the demand curve. So you have a new equilibrium point, a higher price P2, and an increase in the demand, in the quantity demanded from QM to Q2. QM is the market price, the market the market clearing price. So thirdly, a fall in interest rates. It's a question for students to think about what will happen if interest rates fall on this particular diagram. Slide number 38, and this is some extensions to market pricing. First of all, why is the demand curve downward sloping? And the fundamental reason why demand curve is downward sloping is due to differences between consumers' reserve prices. What's the reserve price? It's the price that you are willing to pay. You will not go over this price. So when you go and buy a car, you have a reserve price over which you will not go higher. If you buy a can of beans, there is a reserve price over which you will not pay, regardless of your income. So if a can of beans is, the normal price would be 30p, but you might well be willing to pay up to 50p. You have the fact that you're paying only 30p is that you have a bit of quite a bit of consumer surplus. If you wish to spend £20,000 on a car and you find the car you want at £15,000, you will have received a consumer surplus equal to £5,000. But different consumers have very different reserve prices. For the same car, I may well have a reserve price which is lower than 20,000. So I look at a car at 15,000, I might consider the reserve price to be, my reserve price to be 16,000. I will then only achieve a consumer surplus of just £1,000. What happens if my reserve price is below the market price? So my reserve price for this car would be £10,000. I see that the market price is £20,000. Quite simply, what happens next is I don't buy the car. I leave that market. So if you look at the diagram, all the demand left of QM is due to consumers all having a reserve price equal to the market price or higher, There will be people close to the origin, that's the corner, who have a very high reserve price. For our particular example, the car, they are willing to go up to £80,000-90,000 for this car. If they're asked to pay just 20,000, they receive a huge amount of consumer surplus. Adding all the different consumer surpluses enjoyed by different consumers, we have the shaded area, which is the total consumer surplus, and it's the summation of the differences between the reserve prices of all your customers and the market price. Why is this so important for business firms? The importance is that that shaded area represents revenue foregone. It's something that the business firm cannot grab, it's not available to the business firm. The business will sell QM at price PM, so that rectangle QM PM is sales, is the revenue for the firm. But if the firm could charge individual customers their reserve price, they could grab a lot of the consumer surplus. So the issue is, can firms discover consumers' reserve prices? Well, in most cases, in 99% of the cases, they can't. When you have bargaining in a particular market, so for example, you wish to buy a car, you go to the sales room. Is it called a sales room? Well, wherever you buy a car, Showroom, that's it, showroom. When you go to the showroom and you have a reserve price, what the salesman will try and find out, what the saleswoman will try and find out, is exactly what your reserve price. How far are you willing to go? So it's a negotiating thing, it's a bargaining thing, and when you buy a car, you're really up against a professional who is trying to discover your reserve price. And of course, you will be trying not to reveal your reserve price. All sorts of psychology takes place when you buy a car, of course. Anyway, if you're interested in consumer surplus, you can read it up in any basic textbook. Slide 39, here we're looking at government price controls, and here we'll be looking at maximum prices. So governments fix the maximum price. Although the market price is PM, the government feels that this price is too high, and it arbitrarily fixes, not arbitrarily, but it fixes price below the equilibrium price, a maximum price above which firms cannot charge. So let's assume the maximum price is P max, and therefore what happens is quantity supplied falls. If prices are low, then firms will move out of the market. There is no profit, or there is very less profit. Let's move on to some other activity. And the resultant quantity supplied is at QS. The quantity supplied is OQS. What about demand? Well, you can see that demand at the lower price will now increase to OQD. The demand will be at QD. What you have excess demand over supply. More is being demanded than is actually being supplied. This is a shortage. Now, under normal free market conditions, a shortage will simply trigger off increases in prices. But the government will not allow price to rise above the maximum price. So you have to find some alternative form of rationing. There is a shortage of goods, you have to ration those goods. In a free market, goods are rationed by price. So what happens in this particular case? The first thing that happens might well be the oldest form of distribution of goods is queuing. So people queue up, and first in line will secure the supply, will secure the products. Those at the end of the queue will get nothing. The second consequence might well be shopkeeper preference, where the firm or the distributor decides how to ration the goods. So when we had petrol shortages, petrol stations would ration the supply of petrol by the frequency of their clients, their customers. So regular customers would get more litres, be allowed more litres compared to just passing trade. It's up to shopkeepers. It's not shopkeepers, it's just an old-fashioned name. It's up to firms, distributors to decide what criteria they wish to impose. Now, of course, these may not be democratic, so governments may be a bit nervous about that. So the governments may well step in and determine some formal rationing policy. So typically governments will produce coupons, and people will exchange coupons for the supply, for the product in question. Finally, a consequence could be a black market. Wherever you have maximum prices, you will have a black market. People are willing to pay above the price, above the maximum price. Their reserve prices are higher than the price, the maximum price. So if you look at the diagram, you are producing OQS. What would be the black market price if all of that supply were to be sold illegally? And the answer is, if you look at the diagram, the black market price will be way up the top. You simply read from your demand curve the new price, the black market price. And you'll see that, of course, the black market price is a function of the slope of the demand curve. If the slope is shallow, then the black market price will be lower. If the demand curve is steeper, then the black market price will be very much higher. So again, the steepness of the slope will determine the black market price. And I'll leave it up to you to decide why the demand curve should be steep or should be shallow. Questions for discussion. Again, have a look at these questions, and if you have any problems, any issues, please email me. So there are 5 questions in all. And here is the reading. Once again, one of my books, The Economics and Business Strategy, covers a lot of what I've discussed, and this particular book can be found in the library, the ebooks library. But there are also, this material is covered in other books, such as Worthington and Britton, which is specifically aimed at students doing this particular type of module. If you want to look at economics textbooks, the most famous one currently is Sloman. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's the end of the discussion of microeconomics. Slide 43, the macroeconomy. Slide 44, the key macroeconomic objectives. Let's look at the macroeconomic issues that we'll be looking at. Firstly, economic growth, then unemployment, inflation, and finally international trade. Let's look at these in the concept of a model of the macroeconomy. Slide 45, the circular flow of income. This will be a very simplified model of the economy. We will assume that consumers, households will spend all their income. There will be no savings. We assume that there is no government. And finally, we assume that there is no foreign trade. The economy is a closed economy. So following those assumptions, let's build up how a traditional economy might have functioned. So we begin with the factors of production. These are the resources, the inputs into the production. So we'll have labour, capital, land, and enterprise. Most of us supply labour, some of us will invest, some will own land, and some of us might become entrepreneurs. So these are the factors of production. These are then seen as factor inputs by the firms. And what firms do is they combine these factors of production and they will produce an output. This output is then bought by consumers. And what do consumers do? What do households do? Well, they are in fact the suppliers of the factors of production. Consumers, households supply labour, capital, land, and enterprise. And this is called the real flow. The flow of real resources, the flow of goods and services. We also have a monetary flow. So the firms will buy the factor inputs. To them, that is a cost of production. This cost, however, is an income in the form of wages to labour, interest payments to suppliers of capital, rents to those people who own land, and profits to those people who are the entrepreneurs. So this income accrues to households or consumers, and what do people do? On the basis of our assumption, they spend all that money on what the firms produce, and this to the firm is revenue, and this is the money flow. So this is a very, very simplified picture of a simple economy. Remember, all income is spent, there is no government, and there is no foreign trade. You can see that income, expenditure and output are measuring exactly the same flows. So that's why GDP or output can be seen as national income. Slide 46. This is an extension to the circular flow. This is a little bit more a finer picture of the real economy. And we start here with consumers and producers, the firms. And we've seen that producers will pay consumers an income for the supply of their factors of production, and consumers will spend that money, consumption. So this is the circular flow of income that we examined on the previous slide. Now, in practice, not all consumption, not all income is spent. Part of it will be saved for all sorts of reasons. That saving, which can be seen as a leakage from the circular flow, is balanced by investments from firms, investments from savers, whatever. The mechanics of channeling savings into investments is through the financial sector. I've named it just banks. Going back to the households, the consumers, money is spent, part of it is saved, part of the income goes to government in the form of taxation. That is balanced out by government spending, and government spending is just referred to as government, and the two are in balance through the budget. Of course, governments can have a budget deficit or a budget surplus, but in a perfect world, the two will be balanced. What the government collects, it will spend, and it's the budget that lays out the plans for taxation and the plans for government spending. Finally, our fourth leakage, our fourth factor that households will spend on are the imports. This is money that leaves the circular flow, leaves the domestic economy, the money which is spent on foreign goods. These are the imports, and that's balanced out what we in the economy produce for foreign consumption, exports. And the two are kept in balance through the balance of payments and through the mechanics of the exchange rate. That's the theory, of course. There could be imbalances, of course. So here we have the more better looking explanation of the economy, taking into account all the leakages and all the injections. Aggregate demand in the economy is then made up of four items: consumption, investment, government and exports. So the economy must produce enough goods and services to satisfy consumers, to satisfy firms in the form of investments, Thirdly, to satisfy government, because governments make demands on the economy, demands like roads and schools and hospitals. And finally, aggregate demand is made up of foreign demand in the form of exports. So once again, the economy in the form of producers or firms must meet these demands. If the firms do not meet this demand, there will be problems, macroeconomic problems, adjustment issues. Slide 47, aggregate demand. And what is aggregate demand? It's really just stating what we've discussed in the previous slide. Aggregate demand is consumption and investment and government and net exports. This aggregate demand has been managed by governments through a combination of monetary and fiscal policies. Monetary policy is essentially interest rates, and fiscal policy is taxation and government spending. Slide 48, the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve, which measures the relationship between the price level, total prices in the economy, and total output in the economy. The aggregate demand curve, the total demand curve in the economy, is the same as the demand curve for an individual consumer, meaning higher prices will mean less demand and lower prices will mean a greater demand for goods and services in the economy. So why does the aggregate demand curve slope downwards? If you look at that sentence, I've missed out the word does. Why does the aggregate demand curve slope downwards? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, if there are low prices, this means that people will substitute substitute domestic goods for foreign goods. So demand for domestic goods will rise. Lower price levels will mean interest rates will fall, and then people will have higher real income, and then they can afford to buy more domestic goods. And finally, the lower the price level is, the greater the value of your savings, and you can then spend this additional money, this additional real savings in the form of greater demand for goods and services. Aggregate demand and now aggregate supply, which is drawn with a positive slope. So the greater the price level, the more firms will produce. And you'll see that there will be an equilibrium there where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply at a given price level. Is, say, at P2, then what happens is that there is an excess demand over supply. So aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. So at price P2, people will bid prices upwards. There is a shortage of supply, so people bid up their price and prices will move upwards until an equilibrium price is reached, PE. Very much like the analysis for the individual consumer. Slide 51, economic growth. The rate of economic growth is simply the rate at which the economy is growing, and this is simply the percentage increase in output over 1 year. There are two ways of looking at growth, or there are two ways measuring growth. There's the actual growth and the potential growth. So the actual growth is the actual annual increase in output, or GDP. Potential growth is the speed at which the economy could grow. And This is a percentage of the potential output. So the potential output is what the economy could produce if all its resources were fully employed. All labour, all capital, all land, these are all fully used. The difference between the actual output and the potential output is known as the output gap. How do we work out the potential output? This is on slide 52. It's the OBR's responsibility, it's the Office of Budget Responsibility which calculates this potential output. And the way in which it can measure what the ceiling would be, what the maximum output could be, is to look at the population, the working population that is, look at employment, look at the average hours worked historically, currently, and look at productivity, the output per hour. And on the basis of these calculations, the OBR comes up with the potential output of the economy. Slide 53. What are the benefits of economic growth? Why is it so important to economies to have high growth? Well, first of all, high growth means increased levels of investment, and this means that consumption in the future will rise. There will be more employment, so growth means a reduction in unemployment. There will be a rising standard of living. Through growth, we can enjoy a greater range of goods, a better quality of goods. Next, there will be increased consumption, so we can buy more goods. The next is high business confidence. So with economic growth, firms can invest in future expansion, confident in the knowledge that the economy is growing and that consumption will be growing and more people are finding work. So again, that will generate more income and greater demand for their goods and services. So business confidence is high. And finally, governments could see the potential for redistribution of income. So as people get more wealthy, there is a chance that if the government is politically inclined that way, is to redistribute income. And finally, growth means that the macro problems, such as debt, unemployment and so on, are reduced, and government spending can also be reduced as well. So these are all the benefits of economic growth. And you can see that if economic growth were negative or very low, then all these benefits would not be present. Slide 54. So the objective of governments is to achieve high growth rates, but more importantly, or just as important, is to ensure that this growth is stable. So what you want to avoid is cyclical patterns of economic growth. This will lead to disruption of the macroeconomy and businesses in particular. Slide 55. Economic growth and the business cycle. If you look at this particular chart for 2000 to 2015, you'll see the performance of the economy, the performance of the UK GDP, and what you'll see is clearly cyclical behaviour shown by the yellow line. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it's important that these cycles are kept to a minimum, and in 2008 you'll see that it was very difficult for the government to make sure that the amplitude of fluctuation was kept within limits. The cause of the depression was essentially one that had stemmed from America with the failure of the subprime markets. Slide 56, policies to boost economic growth. So you have these problems of recessions, depressions. Well, one way to get out of these problems is to look at the aggregate demand. Initially, if aggregate demand were to be stimulated, then the economy will start to grow. Well, how can governments stimulate demand? Well, firstly, you can use fiscal policy by cutting tax rates, so consumers have more money to spend, they will buy goods, firms will see that there is increased demand, so they will hire more labour, more people will then be employed, they will then spend their money and so on. So fiscal policy, the cutting of tax rates will boost people's spending, will boost aggregate demand. Failing that, if consumers simply save their extra money, fearful that the economy will not grow, governments will have to step in and they will increase or boost aggregate demand by their own expenditures. They will spend money on roads, on railways, on hospitals, and they will inject that additional spending into the economy, that additional demand into the economy. A final way is to use monetary policy, and that is, for example, to cut interest rates, and that will encourage borrowing and, of course, spending, which is increased aggregate demand. Slide 57. Rather than looking at demand, governments may wish to focus on the supply side of the economy. And rather than try and force people to buy more, not force people to buy more, but get people to buy more, they simply focus on the production of more goods. How do they do that? How can they encourage firms to produce more? Well, 4 bullet points there. You can cut business taxes, corporation tax. You could promote research and development for firms, for business to become more efficient. You can promote mobility of labour if there is unemployment in a particular part of the economy, particular part of the country, and there is a lack of labour in another part of the country, then encouraging that mobility will be beneficial. And generally promote education and training to boost productivity. Slide 58. We now turn to the second macroeconomic variable, macroeconomic issue, and that is unemployment. Unemployment is just simply the rate of the number of people who are unemployed as a percentage of the labour force. How do we define the unemployed? Well, these are officially defined as people able, available and willing to work at the going wage, but can't find a job despite an active search for work. Quite complicated. It's difficult to fathom just from looking at raw data. So when we come to measure unemployment, the typical way of measuring unemployment in the past was to look at the number of claimants for unemployment benefit. People claiming for unemployment benefit, however, disguise those people who are not actively looking for work. So the second way of measuring unemployment is to use labour force surveys, and this is a questionnaire asked of the unemployed, and they will then tease out issues like the availability of labour, how many people are actually available to work at the going wage rate, and how much time they've spent looking for work. Far more accurate picture of unemployment by looking at these surveys. And you have an international standardised unemployment measure, which is determined by the ILO, the International Labour Organization, and the OECD, and that is supposed to be a common measure across countries around the world, so you can then compare unemployment rates across the world. They also use labour force surveys. Why is unemployment a problem? Well, high unemployment will obviously lead to less earnings, so people will reduce their demand for goods and services, so the economy will slow down, aggregate demand will fall. It's also a waste of resources. You don't want to have idle resources like labour people hanging around with little to do. It also put pressure on public services and governments. So public services mean that the unemployed will obviously be using more of the public service, and the government will lose tax revenue and will have to pay for increased welfare provision, increased unemployment benefit. And the final point is, of course, with high unemployment, this can lead to all sorts of health issues and social problems. Just think of unemployed teenagers getting into trouble. So social problems is an issue. Consequently, unemployment is an important target for most governments to tackle. So let's look at the theory. Unemployment as measured by aggregate demand for labour and aggregate supply of labour. So this measures the relationship between the wage rate in the economy and the number of workers. We have an equilibrium wage rate, which is WE, and the equilibrium quantity of workers demanded and supplied as QE. What if there is the going wage rate is above or below the equilibrium? So let's look at the case which is often examined. What happens if the wage rate is above the equilibrium wage rate at W2? Now you'll see that at W2 there will be additional labour supplied, so people will no longer wish to be unemployed. They will, at the going wage rate, which is relatively high, they will now seek employment. But at this higher wage rate, the demand for labour will actually be less. It will be at B. So the demand for labour is Q2. So you have a problem, is that there is more supply of labour than there is actually demand. So the difference between the two, the distance AB, is in fact the level of unemployment. So this is disequilibrium unemployment. Disequilibrium unemployment. Disequilibrium unemployment is where the real wage unemployment, where wages are greater than the equilibrium wage, and this is the model we looked at in the previous slide. Disequilibrium unemployment could also be caused by cyclical unemployment, which is demand deficient unemployment. Let's now turn to equilibrium unemployment. This refers to a situation where the labour market is in equilibrium, where there is the equilibrium wage in operation, but you will still find people who are out of work, and the reasons are frictional unemployment. This is where people are in between jobs. They're looking for employment. They've left their current job. They're expecting to find work pretty quickly. There is structural unemployment, which is caused by changing patterns of demand or technology, or regional unemployment, fundamentally this is where old industries, old methods of doing producing things have disappeared and have left a lot of people out of work, and these people are immobile and reluctant to retrain. So you have this group of unemployed who simply are not attracted by changes in the wage rate. Seasonal unemployment is also a factor of equilibrium unemployment. This is where people are specialise in working in the seasons, like summer workers, people picking fruit, or people working in holiday resorts. When winter time comes round, these people are out of work. Seasonal unemployment. Slide 64 shows the rate of unemployment in the UK since the early 1970s right through to this year, and you see that there are a number of peaks, 3-4 million people out of work in 83, 1995, and it bumps along, usually complementing the business cycles. So currently it's about 4% of the population who are actively looking for work, who are out of work. 4% is close to the average for the EU and Western type economies. There will be differences, of course. However, if you look at the next slide, slide 65, the level of unemployment is not the same across the various regions. You'll see at the very top, the red line, this refers to the northeast, the area around Newcastle, Sunderland. This area was heavily reliant on coal, on shipbuilding, on steel, and these industries have declined. They've moved abroad and left behind a whole army of workers who are just simply structurally unemployed. Compare that to the lowest line, which is the blue one, and that represents the southeast. That is where just south of London, where unemployment is very low. Okay, let's move on to inflation now. So inflation is the percentage increase in prices, usually retail prices. So what happens is the government publishes a CPI, an index of consumer prices, each month, and this index is based on 650 goods and services, and it's supposed to reflect what the average consumer will spend their money on. So if you look at the CPI over the last 10, 12 years, you'll see that inflation rate was hit a peak at 5% and got as low as almost 0%. The target inflation rate is around about 2.5%. So you see that the performance is well in line with the target rate of inflation. The historic rate of inflation, however, tells you a very different story. If you look at this chart, you'll see that the previous slide the previous slide accounts for very small changes in inflation. Go back in time and you'll see inflation going over 25%, an annual rate of inflation over 25%. And this is in the early 70s and caused largely by the increase in oil prices, which fed through into the UK economy as well as many other economies, and that caused a big problem for the economy. Causes of inflation. Why does inflation occur? Well, two reasons. Firstly, it could be caused by demand. Demand is just too much for the amount of goods being supplied, or it could be due to supply side factors where the factors of production are simply more expensive. So let's look at demand side inflation. There is excessive demand for the economy. This could be through tax cuts, where people are spending their money but finding that the money doesn't go very far. Perhaps monetary policy may be very lax, or there may well be excessive government spending. So in all, demand is far greater than the supply, far greater than what the economy is producing, and as we discussed earlier, prices will be pulled up. There will be an inflationary pressures on the economy simply because demand is greater than supply. It could be caused by supply side inflation, which is rising production costs like wages. Wages could be going up for all sorts of different reasons. For example, power of trade unions could force wages up. Energy costs could be rising for all sorts of reasons. You can have imported materials, strategic imported materials such as oil. If the price of oil were to rise, that feeds through into the supply side of the economy. All these rising costs will then be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And as the prices rise, of course, then labour will demand higher wages, and you have that famous price wages spiral. Slide 70. Why is high inflation undesirable? Well, it has very serious consequences for the economy and for firms. Fundamentally, if inflation goes out of control, then people lose faith in currency and the economy more or less collapses. Historically, there have been countries, and possibly there are countries today, which do have a high rate of inflation, and the confidence of people has fallen, and people start to use other forms of currency, and generally it's a time of low investment and high unemployment. So that's really runs into the second problem, is that it does create uncertainty and investments fall. If firms find it very difficult to predict what the rate of inflation will be in a year's time or 2 years' time, this will mean that investment is very risky. And if there is little investment, then there will be little in the form of economic growth. Businesses can lose sales to overseas competitors with lower prices. If prices are high domestically but low abroad, then this will affect profits, this will affect employment and competition as firms shift their production overseas. Slide number 71. If there is inflation, then workers will ask for higher wages. I'm assuming they are organised in the form of trade unions, and the demand for higher wages will in fact feed through into the supply side of the economy, and that will then generate more inflation. Balance of payments will worsen, so exports become less competitive. If there is a domestic inflation, that means our goods become very expensive, and at the same time imports will seem to be cheaper, and this imbalance will put pressure on the currency. And finally, there's a problem with redistribution. Inflation does not affect all people equally. If you are on a fixed income, then you will lose through inflation. If you have very little power in the labour market, you will lose through inflation. You will not keep pace with inflation. If you rely on some annuity again, you lose through inflation. If you are a creditor, you lose through inflation. The value of your debt declines with increasing price levels. On the other hand, people with organised labour, people with power in the labour market, people who are debtors, all these people will benefit through inflation. And it's got nothing to do with the groups of people who deserve to have more income or reduction in their income. This is purely arbitrary. So a serious problem of redistribution of income. And here's a picture of what can happen in an economy where the currency collapses totally through very high inflation. This is Germany 1922, where here's the banknotes, packets of banknotes just simply left in the road, and children are building some edifice. Another picture is of a guy collecting his salary, and this is a salary for 1 day's work. Crazy inflation. Eventually the German inflation was simply just too much for people to use the Deutschmark, and they started using other forms of currency or simply barter. The other forms of currency were essentially the US dollar. Okay, slide 74, policies to tackle inflation. As we saw earlier, inflation is caused by demand side problems as well as supply side problems. And if you believe your inflation is caused by too much demand, the way of reducing inflation is to reduce aggregate demand. So one way of reducing aggregate demand is to make borrowing more expensive by increasing the rate of interest. This is monetary policy. Governments can reduce their own expenditure, so governments can put less demand into the economy, or it could increase taxes on firms, on consumers. So if the tax rate goes up, consumers will have less to spend and aggregate demand will go down to the level at which the economy is producing goods and services. Rather than look at the demand side, some people suggest that governments should focus on the supply side, and this is where you try to reduce the rate of inflation through various tax incentives for firms, where you try to curb monopoly power. If you get rid of monopolies and cartels, this will bring down prices. Where you try to increase labour productivity through training and education and so on. So this is to reduce the costs of production. Okay, last item is international trade. This is slide 75. International trade is the exchange of goods and services between countries. Reasons for trade. Well, the first reason is obvious. It's where goods are unavailable in the domestic economy. You may not have the raw materials or specialist labour, the climate may be all wrong, you don't have the capital, so you make use of trade to enjoy these goods and services. I'm sure you can think of many examples. With trade, you have a greater variety of goods and services. You don't just have to rely on domestic production, you can rely on the production from around the world. And international trade can benefit countries through things like specialisation. So countries will focus on what they're good at, and by producing more, then they will benefit from various economies. International trade brings about lower prices because costs will go down, and international trade will mean greater competition for domestic monopolies, domestic oligopolies. Slide 77. Benefits of international trade. The benefits of international trade, of course, are specialisation. And how is this specialisation achieved? Well, there are two theories of specialisation. They're not really theories, but two approaches. One was put forward by Adam Smith, the 18th century economist, and this idea suggests that two countries will focus on what they are good at producing. So if you have country A that is good at producing cars and country B which is good at producing wine, they will trade. A focuses on the specialisation on cars and B will focus on the production of wine, and they trade their surplus. Straightforward, no problems. The second, however, was put forward by David Ricardo. The basis of trade is a comparative advantage, so that if country A is good at producing cars and wine over B, so country A can produce wine better than country B, does that mean that there will be no trade? And the answer is, through the principle of comparative advantage, countries should concentrate on producing those goods where they have a relative advantage. Goods that can be produced at a lower opportunity cost. So if country A is particularly good at producing cars rather than wine, it will focus on the production of cars and it will leave wine production to country B. If you find that difficult to understand, think of the labour market. Think of a case where you have a lawyer and the lawyer employs a gardener. This is like trade. I practice law, my gardener does the gardening. We trade. So if the gardener needs my services, I will supply my services as a lawyer. What happens if I happen to practice law, but I'm also a good gardener, a better gardener than the person I employ? Would that mean I do not employ the gardener? And the answer is no. I will still employ the gardener because I can make more money by practicing law. To spend hours in the garden means I will not be spending those hours in practicing law. This is a theory of comparative advantage. So I will still employ the gardener even though the gardener is poorer at gardening than I am. Slide 78, the restrictions on international trade. Why is it that countries often restrict imports? First reason is that they may wish to protect certain industries, certain firms in their economy, such as infant industries, industries which are new, which are still small, which can't benefit from various economies and are then open to international firms that are large and have already achieved efficiencies. The industry could be strategic. A strategic industry is one that's needed to fight a war. Steel used to be seen as a strategic industry. And declining industries where there is a problem that industry might be is important for political reasons and needs to be protected. Second reason is to save jobs and compete with cheap foreign labour. So in our case, in the UK, we face cheap foreign labour from China, and this means that a lot of British firms may well be locating to China. I suppose the problem is greater in the United States. You may wish to have restrictions on trade if you're subject to dumping. Dumping is where firms are deliberately setting a price below their costs to destroy the domestic industry and then become a monopoly. You could restrict trade to prevent a foreign monopoly, and you could reduce the level of imports simply to ensure that you have a balance of payments. Slide number 79. What are these restrictions on international trade? Well, firstly, you will have quotas. This is just a physical limit on the number of units allowed into the country. It doesn't raise any revenue for the country, whereas tariffs are a tax on foreign goods, on foreign imports. And the idea is that the price of foreign goods plus the tariff will mean that there will be less demand for the foreign good and more demand for the domestically produced good. Also, tariffs raise revenue for the government. 80. Subsidies could be another form of restriction where a government gives a subsidy to a foreign producer, and then the producer will have an unfair advantage over the domestic industry. Qualitative controls or standards can be introduced that will then prevent foreign goods which don't meet the required standards. So these are controls which are deliberately created to keep out foreign goods. And finally, we have administrative delays, which are deliberate extensions of the administration of customs clearance for goods, with the sole purpose of slowing down the rate of imports. Finally, slide 81, we come to a conclusion, and what we've seen is that what is the objective of government macroeconomic policy? Well, it's to have high balanced economic growth, full employment, price stability, and international trade where you have a balance of payments equilibrium. Thank you very much. And the next slide is to do with a group discussion, which you can just look at the questions and consider your particular economy. And finally, the last slide is the reading. And once again, Worthington and Britain, the business environment, covers all the macroeconomic issues well. And if you wish to look at strictly economics textbooks, then the Sloman books are good. Certainly the second one, or the third in the list, Essential Economics for Business, is written with the sort of the manager in mind. And there you'd look at chapters 10, 11 and 12. Okay, thank you very much, and that is the end of my presentation. 83 slides.